Hey everyone, it's Miss Hart. Hope you're having a good day. Today we're going to be talking about imperialism, specifically the second wave of imperialism that really begins in the 19th century. But before we do that, I want you to pause this video and go and grab your notebook if you haven't already, because I'd really like you to take notes on this. And of course, write down any questions that you have as we go over this tomorrow in class. Okay, here it goes. Imperialism is extending a country's empire or territory through diplomacy and force. Now, this is actually the second wave of imperialism that we've gone over this year. This is what we would call new imperialism, 1750 to really 1914. Although, for sure, it doesn't really pick up until the 19th century. The first wave imperialism, also called old imperialism, is something you probably remember from the Age of Exploration, really the 16th century, where European countries colonized parts of North and South America and established colonial empires there. In the early 19th century, Europe really saw a decline in colonial control, specifically in the Americas, with all of those independence movements that we talked about in the previous unit, and also Europe's kind of preoccupation with revolutionary movements like 1848, and all the internal developments we've been talking about, like the unification of Germany and Italy. However, following unification of Germany and Italy, as well as kind of other internal nation-building programs, Europe kind of once again turns its aspirations for national greatness and focuses them outside of the European continent, really looking to kind of rebuild some of these colonial empires that they really started to see disintegrating because of the spread of nationalism and ideas from the French Revolution. With the advance of technology and organization that stems from kind of the Industrial Revolution, European powers in 1870, the late 19th century, possessed both the means and the motives to colonize other parts of the world, specifically Africa and Asia. Compared with the first wave, or old imperialism in the 16th century, the new imperialism of the 19th century involved much more direct control over their colonies, and a bigger focus was placed on developing those colonies internally, specifically their infrastructure. The way I like to remember the causes of European imperialism is I like to use a little trick, a mnemonic device called NERDS. So the N in NERDS is going to stand for nationalism, the E in NERDS, economics, R, religion, and the D and the S are actually going to stand for social Darwinism. So this is kind of like an easy way to remember the causes of European imperialism. So let's start with the first one, nationalism. So all of these European countries are really going to be struck with nationalism in the 19th century. I know that's been one of our big themes that we kind of keep coming back to time and time again. And that kind of nationalism, that fever to kind of be the best of the best in Europe is going to lead these countries to compete with each other in a lot of ways. And just one of the ways they're going to compete with each other is over colonies. Whoever has the most colonies, whoever has the biggest empire is basically going to be able to have bragging rights. They're going to be seen as the best, they're going to be seen as the most powerful, and really 19th century imperialism was really all about empire building, expanding your country's territory to include colonies all over the world. The next cause of imperialism in the 19th century are really economic motives. You know, as nations industrialized, they needed access to raw materials, particularly as a result of the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution really begins right around the year 1850. This is the year that historians really point to as roughly kind of the dividing of the initial phase of industrialization from a new phase, or the second kind of phase of Industrial Revolution, the one that's characterized by a larger scale of industrial enterprises, further geographic expansion of industry, and certainly a much closer relationship between science and its application in technology and industry. You know, this new phase is what we call the Second Industrial Revolution. in the periods 1875 to 1910 really represents probably the greatest concentration of technological advance, including our own age, in really the history of the human race. Steam engines now powered larger factories. There was more mechanized production, new modes of production, including the assembly line, which is invented by Henry Ford and is used to produce cars, okay, which are some of the key components of really this second industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution was really focused on heavy industry and steel, chemicals, petroleum, which we would know as kind of oil, gasoline, and of course automobiles. Now, these second wave or kind of second industrial revolution products are much different than really the first industrial revolution that we were talking about that started in 1750 and really goes through the beginning of the 19th century. In the first kind of industrial revolution, the focus was certainly on consumer goods, things like textiles. But in the second industrial revolution, really in 1850 forward, the second half of the 19th century, the focus is going to be on things like steel, chemicals, electricity, and automobiles. And, you know, this is going to have a huge impact on 19th century society. Because of inventions like Henry Ford's assembly line, goods are produced much more efficiently, and this is going to create a need for markets. So this is where the connection to the second wave of imperialism comes in. So the second industrial revolution, goods are being produced more quickly, more efficiently, and you need someone to sell them to. The overproduction of goods really kind of caused some problems in the 19th century in Europe, so Europeans start looking for other places to sell their products to. And this is why they're going to colonize a lot of places. There are going to be markets for their trade goods, for these industrial goods, as well as kind of like a source of raw materials. This is really going to kind of increase, you know, the second industrial revolution is really important, not just because of the connection to imperialism, but also because it kind of creates an increasing consumer culture, especially in Western Europe. The third cause of imperialism in the 19th century is going to be religion. In the 19th century, missionaries had kind of a long tradition of going to Africa. At first, they were really medical missionaries, but they were followed in the 19th century by British middle-class Victorians who really believed it was their duty to civilize the quote-unquote inferior races. You know, this is very kind of ethnocentric, very paternalistic, that Europeans kind of thought that their religion, Christianity specifically, and that their culture is superior, and that they're going to be bringing religion to what they really viewed as people who were uncivilized. The next cause, social Darwinism, is really going to be very much closely related to religion. Social Darwinism is another one of those isms that you need to know, and that's the theory that individuals, groups, and certain people are really subject, or people in general are subject to the same Darwinian laws of natural selection as plants and animals are. This is now largely discredited, but social Darwinism was really popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and was really advocated by someone named Herbert Spencer. Social Darwinism was used at this time to really justify political conservatism, imperialism, and racism, and really to discourage any sort of intervention and reform. Now, I want you to think about this. If social Darwinism is kind of a popular ideology at this time, Europeans are going to kind of have this belief that they are innately superior to other people in other parts of the world, like Africa and Asia. And if you think you're superior, then what does that give you the right to do? It gives you the right to really kind of conquer other people, and basically you think it's for their own good. Europeans believed that they were bringing kind of civilization to people that they saw were inferior to them. Now, obviously, this is very different than the view that we have today of respecting other cultures and not kind of placing your own culture as superior to anyone else's. But the 21st century is much different than the 19th century. In the 19th century, Europeans kind of like looked around them and they saw themselves as technologically the most advanced in the world, which they were at the time, and the wealthiest with all these new consumer products, and they really thought that this was like a sign that they were truly superior in culture. So social Darwinism really connects to imperialism because it kind of provides moral justification for what these European countries want to do anyways for economic and kind of like national reasons. The second wave of European imperialism ramps up Europe's quest for colonies amongst nations like France, Belgium, Italy, and Germany. But for the British and the Dutch, they already have a colonial presence in Asia that really predates kind of the 19th century wave of imperialism. The group most responsible for really establishing trade with India and eventually making India Britain's most valuable colony was the British East India Company. The British East India Company, you may recall from like a previous period, was a joint stock company that obtained a government monopoly over trade in India. It really acted as virtually an independent government in the regions that it kind of by the mid-19th century, the British East India Company had really gotten total control of India. They had really exploited India's political divisions in order to gain local allies. Essentially, they negotiated independent treaties with all these different Hindu princes on the subcontinent and essentially had indirect control of India. Now we're going to move on to Africa. In the late 19th century, Africa really did have colonies from the prior period. But as you can see by looking at this map, most of those colonies were kind of like relegated to the coastal areas. They were really kind of like trading post colonies. And you can see kind of like Europeans really hadn't penetrated the interior of Africa to colonize. That's all going to change in 1881 with something that we call the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa really is started by Belgium. If you recall, Belgium is this tiny little country nestled in between France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And the Belgians, really King Leopold II of Belgium, seeks to kind of acquire this huge piece of territory in Central Africa that we call the Congo. The Congo is kind of a rainforest region there. That's a very, very, it's very lush. It has a lot of natural resources. In particular, there is a lot of rubber in the Congo. And now rubber is going to be essential for 19th century Europeans. In the 19th century, like, rubber was used for a lot of things. Cars, bicycles, the tires of cars and bicycles both needed rubber. And rubber is really this plant that once you kind of dry out, it can be processed and can be formed into these tires. And because of these new consumer products that people in Western Europe were really obsessed about in the late 19th century, to manage the opening of Africa to colonization, Otto von Bismarck calls the Berlin Conference in 1884, which is basically a meeting of all the great European powers. At that conference, all the great powers basically devised procedures for the establishment of colonies in Africa. As a result, Europeans claimed huge portions of Africa by drawing lines on a map, usually with no regard for linguistic or tribal divisions. You can kind of see here that many of the colonial boundaries are really straight lines, almost as if they had been drawn with a ruler. To wrap up, Africa was completely changed by the second wave of imperialism in the 19th century, with all but two regions being completely colonized, Liberia and Ethiopia. Tomorrow we're going to be focusing in on responses to imperialism and why some countries like Ethiopia were successful in resisting and some were not. That's all I have for today. See you tomorrow.